all have copies of the report, I assume, and you all have copies of the Republican response. Thank you. So, questions?
Are you guys all convinced that the governor really does not know about this allegation?
Well, we didn't question the governor. And he, I believe, has said publicly he didn't know. And everybody testified to the fact that they did not tell him. So that's what the record says.
The report questions the veracity of some of the witnesses. So I'd like the political judge for this group to, is it plausible to you that nobody told the governor this whole period?
Well, I'm not going to answer what I could guess at. I'm only going to answer what we have the facts to, and that's the testimony that we took under oath.
Senator, given your harsh words for folks in the administration, do you think that anybody that's currently serving with the governor should resign or step down?
I think that's up to the governor. He's the one who is served by these people. He is the one who appoints them.
Yeah, I think that when you have a team around you, and especially someone like the governor, I think it's up to him. That's his decision to make as to whether he feels fit that some of the people that are around him could really do more help or more harm.
You had indicated in the report that it seemed that there were people who didn't tell the truth, and I think the word perjurous might have been employed. Is this something that you were going to pursue? Perjury before the committee?
The report is out there, and any law enforcement agency that chooses to look at it can. We've issued our report, period.
Are there any legal consequences if someone
I'm sorry?
committed perjury before the committee? I don't know. Is it the same as committing perjury in a courtroom or different?
We'll let the lawyers
We'll let
answer.
the lawyers handle that question. It's illegal.
Well, there is a crime of false swearing if somebody swears falsely under oath. There would be legal consequences, but our committee was not a legislative grand jury. We looked at the facts, we found the facts, we issued our report. Whether or not this is a criminal justice matter will be up for prosecutor's office or the attorney general, and not us.
When a witness comes before this body, any legislative body, and they place their hand on the Bible and raise their right hand, they swear to tell the truth. And a legislative committee such as this can only function effectively and properly if they get fair, honest testimony. The report indicates that we have some questions about the legitimacy of the testimony was received.
Mr. Weinberg, what would you like to see happen now?
Said, Anthony, talk a little louder, please.
What would you like to see happen now as a result?
Well, I think in the report we also talk about some legislative priorities, which I think we're going to try to follow through on. And what I would like to see happen, and I'm assuming so would everybody else up here and out there, is that this kind of thing is never repeated. And that when somebody makes an allegation of rape, it's taken seriously and it's investigated appropriately.
It's frustrating for us because we feel as a committee that there were policies and procedures in place, and those policies and procedures weren't enforced or followed. So the system didn't fail Katie Brennan. The people in the administration and the transition team failed Ms. Brennan, and that should never happen again.
Ma'am, you seem to suggest that Governor Murphy had something to play some role in this. Would you like to spell it?
It's hard to believe as an average person that he didn't know. And if he didn't know, that's just as troubling, because you have high people in the administration that have a legal and professional obligation to let their client know what's going on. Nobody likes to give their boss bad news, but sometimes you have to do it because it's the right thing to do. And we don't know if that happened here.
There were so many instances of people doing things that were questionable or wrong. Did anyone in state government do everything right? Or anything right?
Besides the committee.
Thank you for the addendum.
So I think that what obviously this revealed is that there has to be a better process. And we understand that it's a chaotic process when a new governor comes into and takes his oath. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that a lot of things or a lot of policies and procedures that we currently have should just go on the face of the wind. I think that obviously this brings up a lot of issues that within our report we have suggestions of policy changes moving forward. And I think that for myself, and I'm sure a lot of others here on the committee, I think that that's the most important thing that we're going to come out of this with.
Do you all have any judgment as to whether Esther Suarez, the Hudson County prosecutor, knew that her office was investigating an acquaintance?
Are you asking, do we have an opinion, or do we know?
Do you know? And the
No.
follow-up question is, if not, why didn't you call her to testify and ask her?
Do you want to?
Well, use hand. Well,
Thank you.
I mean, we had to look at our mandate. Our mandate was clearly to look into the matters that were raised regarding the hiring of Ms. Alvarez. And we also had to consider that the Attorney General's office had contacted us and asked us to limit our inquiry until they finished their investigation. Coupled with that, we had a finding by the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office that there was no basis to proceed with the prosecution. And considering our mandate, we just felt it was appropriate under the circumstances to limit our hearing to the witnesses we call, understanding that there were issues that were raised in terms of text messages regarding whether Esther Suarez was aware or not aware, and we just assumed, based upon the facts that we developed, that we would limit our inquiry to the witness that we called.
But Mike, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought that the mandate, I could be wrong about this, but I thought the mandate spells out quite clearly the Hudson County Prosecutor's Office is part of your mandate.
Yes.
It seems to me that was an investigation.
Yes, it was, and then we received a request from the Attorney General's office to limit what we were going to look into regarding Ms. Suarez, and we followed that request.
While he was investigating.
Yes.
When you held hearings after he concluded the investigation.
And after he concluded the investigation, we had the findings of the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office, which basically supported the conclusions of the Hudson County Prosecutor's Office. Whether we agree with that or disagree, we just abided by that finding.
So the reason you didn't call Suarez then is what? It wasn't a mandate.
I'm sorry?
It wasn't a mandate.
Yes, but
so the reason is, why didn't you?
Well, because at the end of the day, we had findings by both the Prosecutor's Office of Hudson County, findings of the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office, and an interview, an investigation conducted by the Attorney General's Office, finding no wrongdoing. Based upon the collective judgment of those three governmental agencies, we felt, based upon what our mandate was and what we're looking to do, that it was, a discretional call. We exercised that discretion not to call her.
And Tom, at some point in time, the committee and the attorneys made investigative priorities of their own. And once you have the Attorney General's internal investigation indicated no impropriety, Middlesex found, rightly or wrongly, no basis for bringing charges. The Attorney General then issued a statement that as far as he was concerned, he agreed with both Hudson and Middlesex, no basis for bringing charges. And we were not going into the underlying facts as to whether or not the sexual assault occurred or didn't occur. In view of that, we had higher priorities than asking the question whether or not she knew or didn't know somebody, because we couldn't go into whether or not criminal charges should have been brought or not. That was a decision made by the lawyers to some extent in terms of our priorities, because we took 10 hearings to get where we are.
In the interest of looking forward as well, can someone discuss some of what the recommendations are for changes going forward?
Well, I think that they are in the report. You'll see them there. But certainly issues around transition committees and how much more they should be brought under state jurisdiction. The issues also around when you've got policies and procedures is one thing. How you make sure they're followed is something else. So I think there's a lot of processes, a lot of procedures, and some legislation that we outlined in the report.
Is the work of this committee complete, and will the committee be dissolved before the end of the legislative session?
We consider this report complete. The committee stays in existence until the end of this legislative term.
So you have no intention of meeting again or doing any?
Well, I'm not planning to right now, I'll tell you that.
Sorry.
I said
Not
I'm
right
not
now.
planning to right now.
But just also, I mean, that's why I would be remiss to say, I know we have two very important attorneys when it comes to the criminal process.
We have 3 plus me.
But, but I just want to say what was also important for us is to make sure that we have Ms. Alito and have her also be involved in the process so that we would really come away with this with policies that we plan on moving forward and implementing. So I just wanted to make that
And
part
many of the
statement.
recommendations were originated by Ms. Alito.
Yes.
Yeah, and we had several hours of testimony from an expert in this field who I think spoke in very plain language about what should have happened here.
Mike, forgive the crudeness of this question, but I know you're currently representing George Norcross. How can we be assured that your work on his behalf in no way, got into this?
Well, I think the hearings here.
Wait a minute, I'll answer that question. First of all, that is a crude question. I think Mr. Critchley is an attorney of the highest integrity, and there was never any hint, any place, that these attorneys, any of the 3 of them, played politics, guided us in an inappropriate road, and I love you, Ryan, but that was a bad question.
And I just want to say that, it was, we had excellent advice because not only did Mike and Joe work well together, but they really worked well with even between the Senate co-chairs and the Assembly co-chairs on the Republican side. So, there was none of this, and you know that.
And I'd just like to respond. It was not a good question. It was a fair question. I expect it to come from Tom Moran.
He texted him.
Et tu, Brute.
No, I mean, it's a fair question. But we, as you could see, the reporters and the media that covered these hearings, we were open, we were transparent, we were fair. We tried to get at the facts as best we can. We treated the witnesses fairly. And I think, as the chairperson pointed out, that the work of the committee speaks for itself. This was not done in the dark. It was not done opaquely. And you, as the media, can draw your own conclusions based upon what you see and what you hear. And I think if I had an opportunity to speak with each and every one of you, I don't think any one of you would disagree with any of the things that we made findings in the report. I think everybody would concur. It's one thing if we made some findings that were unduly provocative. Every finding we made was reasonably based upon the facts, and we tried to be fair to everyone. We tried to be fair to Katie Brennan, we tried to be fair to Mr. Albrecht, and we tried to be fair to the administration. And in light of that, we made some recommendations. Understandably, the recommendations, as was pointed out by the co-chair, were hard-hitting, but they were hard-hitting, but at the end of the day, those findings were fair.
And to take, just to Mike's point, if you look at the report, about the first 65 pages are facts, the factual basis. And what we did in our 9 days of hearings is make a factual record. We made a timeline. And some of you who were here all the time noticed that some of the lawyers kept saying, I want to go to the timeline, I want to go to the timeline. And if you look at the report, from the timeline, we draw conclusions and make findings. We have opinions about mistaken legal judgments. We have opinions as to troublesome testimony, a certain section. And then we have the recommendations. And I represent also, there was not one time that any legal decision, any strategic decision was made for any kind of political agenda, any kind of personal agenda. It always was, what will move the ball down the field and what will give us the best, fairest result, because we wanted to be fair in this report, and we didn't speculate. We based our decisions on the facts.
Have you received any reaction from the administration?
No.
Senator,
will
do
you
you
be
think
released?
this actually helps Katie Brennan's lawsuit against the state, even though that's not true?
I don't know. That's not the purpose of the report, and if it does, it does, and if it doesn't, it doesn't.
Senator, will you be releasing will the committee be releasing any documents that the committee received throughout the course of this, similar to what happened during the Bridgegate hearings?
If they make the appropriate application, we'll deal with it.
Yeah, so to be honest with you, we haven't fully discussed that aspect of it. I know we said that at some point after the hearings, but we'll make a decision on that.
Did the committee miss an opportunity to do a deeper dive of the appropriate political patriotism
Well, there are limits to what we can and cannot do. In terms of our mandate, we were looking at the Alvarez matter. We drew factual and legal conclusions based upon that. And could we look into that? I mean, I think that's a question that anyone could answer. You could look at that in any
Your
administration,
mandate
anytime.
included Marcellus Jackson, Derek Green, and others,
Right.
correct?
Yes, and we, as we indicated, as we were going along, we limited ourselves to basically on Mr. Alvarez because there's time constraints. I mean, we could go on and on. This committee could have gone on for another 6 months.
So why not?
But let me finish. But based upon the platform facts in terms of Mr. Alvarez and how he was hired and the questions surrounding his hiring, those types of questions apply to everyone that you just mentioned. And I think the conclusions that were drawn as they relate to Mr. Alvarez could also relate to the other questionable hiring. So you could draw a conclusion based upon what we found with Mr. Alvarez in terms of the questionable hiring. Does it apply to others? Yes.
And
Last question?
I just want to pun off of just really quickly what Mr. Critchley said. At the end of the day, we know that every new team is going to hire people that they would want. And that's not to say that we're here to say you should or you shouldn't. But at the end of the day, you still have to follow a process and a protocol. And that's really, and our going over the Katie Brennan situation, the Al Alvarez, was really what was the most telling, that everyone should go through the same process.
Last question?
Kind of piggybacking up on that, there was a note in one of the on one of the pages about the SDA.
Footnote, yes, there's a footnote.
And there was a reference that the AG's office or the state commission investigation may also look into the matter.
I think they are.
There was some reference in the news media that they were looking into it, yes, that the subpoenas had been out.
So, but that was just that added to the report was just based off of news reports? Nothing, was there anything else that you folks are aware of?
Our understanding is that there's a few investigations going on, but we're not sure.
Did this committee make all the decisions itself about who to call and who to subpoena, or did leadership, Steve Sweeney or Craig Coughlin, get involved for strict options?
No, we made those decisions collectively and with the attorneys to follow the logical timeline.
And we tried to make it almost like you would in a trial. It wasn't a coincidence, as Mike pointed out. We start out with Ms. Brennan, we ended with Mr. Alvarez. It wasn't a coincidence that after we brought somewhat reluctant witnesses in from the administration, we had an expert testimony from Seton Hall law professor who indicated that some of the legal judgments were erroneous, and we had an expert as to sexual abuse and the problems that happened there. We tried to make it understandable in a way that ultimately would lead to a fair fact-finding with due process for everybody.
Thanks, everybody.